Dominant defense at Oklahoma? Okay, maybe. Maybe you can tell me on that. But more dominant than the offense? Well, we'll find out from Jason Ray from Last Word on College Football. The Sooners are in camp. The spring game is just a couple weeks away. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing good, Mark. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's strange, the airwaves and just kind of the media. The defense is dominating the discussion, which is a far cry than anything that we've seen, out of this team over the last, 15, 17 years. But there is more excitement, believe it or not, on the defensive side of the ball, maybe than there is on the offensive side of the ball.
Please like the video, share the videos on social media, and please subscribe right here at the Voice of College Football. So, Jason, a number of the members of the coaching staff on that side of the football and defensive players met with the media this week. So, kind of run through where the storylines laid out this week.
Yeah, so this week Brian Odom had an opportunity to talk with the press for Oklahoma earlier this week, and talked obviously a lot about the linebacking core. I think it's a group, Mark, that has been very, in the past, if they've had an injury, they've been really, they've struggled a little bit from a depth perspective, going all the way back to 2008 in the Oklahoma-Texas game. They had an injury. Ryan Reynolds got hurt late in the third quarter, ended up really costing Oklahoma. They struggled the balance of that game. They've had a couple of other throughout the years where they've had an injury and they've not been able to recover from that from a depth perspective. But, listening to Brian Odom talking about bringing that consistency each and every day, when they bring that consistency, of course, a little bit of this is coach speak, but, he feels like there's not a deeper and more talented group in the country than the Oklahoma linebacking group that they have right now. So a couple of guys that he really singled out and talked about was Brian Asamoah, leading tackler of the linebacking core last year, the leading tackler overall of the team last year. Really talked about how dynamic of a player that he is. One of the things that he really needs to work on throughout the spring and fall is, open field tackling a little bit. But, in terms of, a first step, being able to diagnose the plays, he's a kid that Brian Odom and the Oklahoma defensive staff is really going to count on to be, a leader in that group. And I think another guy who's really kind of becoming a budding superstar is David Agboebu. He's a guy that played he played a little bit more last year than he shared time with Deshaun White in the middle. And, he got more and more playing time as the season went on. And really, he's a guy that they think that can be, that next great linebacker, kind of in a Kenneth Murray mold, just in terms of quick first step, being able to get downhill quickly. And, I think, Mark, we'll talk about some of the position battles, obviously, that we have through spring and then as we get to fall. I think perhaps the biggest position battle might be that middle linebacker spot with him and Deshaun White. I think all signs point to him. And it's not really anything that Deshaun White has not done. It's just, kind of the elevation of him, really David Agboebu right there at that linebacker spot. Just the dynamic playmaking ability that he has the ability to bring to this team. And, a couple of other guys that he singled out. Shane Witter is a guy who off the chart athleticism, played a little bit sparingly as a true freshman last year. He's a guy that Odom was extremely high praise. Linebacker, he runs a 4.4. I think that kind of talks about the depth that Oklahoma has been able to get at the linebacker position, where you have a kid that's a 4.4 guy, 220, looks the part, has speed all over the field, is a pretty good tackler, is a guy that, when he came in last year, you didn't really see a whole lot of a breakout, in terms of, not having that same production at that linebacker position. And he's a guy that's probably not going to be a starter. Might be in the mix, might be in the competition, but he's not going to be being a starter. So that kind of talks to the level of depth that Oklahoma has at the linebacking position, something that they haven't had in quite some time.
So we know the defense is better. We've talked about it since the end of the regular season on through the performance in the bowl game. that whether you go with the traditional standard statistics, points per game, yards per game, all of that, or even dive into the advanced metrics, the improvement is substantial. It's going from 85th, 90th, 95th type rankings in the country to top 15 to 25 rankings this past season. I would love to know if it's been addressed in regards to what the coaches think the difference is. Is it Grinch? Is it the entire coaching staff? Is it an upgrade in talent? Is it better scheme, attitude, effort, all those things?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of those things put together, Mark. I think it was a little bit of a question mark coming into this season. Sure, they improved in Grinch's, first season in 2019, but we all saw that performance against LSU, and I think nationally the thought was, are they really that much better? To your point, I think they were 89th, 90th, which is, not Oklahoma standards, but certainly much better than they have been over the last few years, prior to that under Mike Stoops. And then, the gigantic leap that they made this year, top 30 overall defense from, 89th, 90th in 2019. I think part of it's the culture that some of the kids have talked a little bit about the culture, not being something that some of these new kids have to learn. It's something that's embedded in the Oklahoma defense right now. Grinch's culture has manifested itself just in terms of the way they like to play, and I think it was a little bit surprising. I don't know that anyone really knew what to expect last year coming into this COVID season where they didn't have a spring, they didn't have the typical, fall practice that they would. And so to see how much they improved over the course of the year, I think was really impressive. And so I think to your point, it's just a little bit of everything. I think the culture is better. They've definitely had a massive upgrade in talent on the defensive side of the ball. I think they're battling teams like Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson for some of these recruits when they were, previously they were battling some mid-major teams and some, lower end Power 5 teams. So the recruiting, the defensive staff has taken a step up. So I think you put all of those together, that kind of points to, the increase in productivity over, last year to this year. And, this year you look at, how can you get better? Top 30 is great. What do they need to do to get to the top 15? And I think it's one of those from a mentality perspective. Brian Odom talked a little bit about this. Grinch talked about this before, and before the mentality was, kind of last man standing in terms of, okay, I'm the only guy here, so I get to play by default. So kind of the culture is having, a sense of urgency, having, that ability to get on the floor immediately. Get on the court. Get on the field immediately, I should say, and really just having that, different mentality to know exactly what needs, because I think this group as a whole knows that they're the reason that Oklahoma at least hasn't won a playoff game or maybe hasn't won a national championship, over the last 5 years. So I think they certainly understand that sense of urgency, and they seem to have the talent and the depth that really all three levels of the defense to be able to compete for that national championship this year.
That's what separates the playoff teams, Oklahoma included in many respects, with everybody else, even top 15 to 20 teams in the country, is they stack those waves of tremendous athletes at any one position. Therefore, they guard themselves against injuries. They guard themselves against just guys not coming through and living up to the expectations. They guard themselves against guys showing up and not feeling as though they need to try that hard, because you go to a number of programs, even high-level programs, and if you're the only high four-star at the wide receiver position and everybody else is much less talented than you only need to be pushed so much, and you're still probably the best player, even if you're not playing at your best. You're still the best player, you're going to play. But, man, right. You go to some of these schools and some of these depth charts at certain positions, and, man, you better not just be as talented as you are. You better bust your tail and learn the plays and know what you're doing and be disciplined and do all the right things to see playing time.
No, you're absolutely right, Mark. And I think that's a difference, competitive balance within the roster, specifically when you talk about the front seven for Oklahoma, which is the strength of the defense. Certainly, you talk to some of the media members and listen to some of the things that they say, and listening to the coaches and players, you get the feeling that this team is very, very comfortable, going 3 deep, both at the defensive line and the linebacker position. There's a lot of talent there that's returning. Certainly there's Ronnie Perkins that they lost, but outside of that, there's not a lot of loss on the linebacker or the defensive line. So that front seven is as good as you would expect at any team in the country. And we talk a lot about recruiting, but kind of looking ahead, just as a indicator on how much this team, this staff has come, just in terms of getting the good players, getting the highly ranked players on campus. Oklahoma leads for five-star kids on the defensive side of the ball in 2022 recruiting. So obviously they're not going to land all of those, but at this point, to be in the conversation at these different levels from a defensive tackle perspective, a linebacker, a safety, you're in that conversation, and at this point you lead, and from a crystal ball perspective, you lead 5 different 5-star defense. It just kind of points to how Grinch has been able to change that culture along with the defensive staff and be able to recruit and know that, a lot of times the moniker at Oklahoma, or necessarily the Big 12, is some of the great defensive players didn't want to come to Oklahoma, or they didn't want to play in the Big 12 just because of being a pass-happy league. But I think not only Oklahoma, but as good as defensive Iowa State played last year, and just the conference just in general has started to play a little bit better defense. So I think that moniker is being turned around a little bit, knowing that you can still put players in the NFL, you can still be All-Americans, you can still win championships in the Big 12. I think that it's turning those tables around in the conversation a little bit differently for Oklahoma.
Despite their issues in the win-loss column not meeting expectations, Texas has at times fielded some near-dominant defenses in the last 5 to 6 years. I thought Oklahoma State, before they took that November slide, I thought they were playing great defense for the most part. West Virginia led the nation in pass defense last year. Now, some of that might speak to opponent and so forth, but still, if you're number 1 in the nation in pass defense, you're probably one of the top 10 to 15 pass defenses in the nation. So the Big 12, again, we've had this conversation. If you just take away the names and look at the scores from the last couple seasons, you're not going to be able to tell a difference between the Big 12 and the other major conferences in college football. So the defense has been upgraded and brought down the offensive statistics. No question about that. Anything else since the last time we had you on, Jason, in regards to anything that's popped up in spring camp?
Yeah, I think one of the things from the secondary perspective, Mark, I think one of the things that I've, keep hearing a little bit about is Latrell Mccutchen, true freshman cornerback who was originally committed to Alabama, flipped to Oklahoma, decided to come in the spring. He's a guy that's really being talked about as a kid that's really impressive, and maybe to the point that he could be in the mix for a starting cornerback position. I think that on the defensive side, the cornerback slot was really a position of not necessarily weakness, but maybe not as strong from a depth perspective as the other 2 areas of the defense. So having him as a guy that can compete really gives Oklahoma a fairly strong 2 deep at the cornerback position. I think right now, if the game started right now, you would probably have DJ Graham starting one cornerback position and Woody Washington starting the other, but you have Latrell Mccutchen there, as well as Jaden Davis as a guy who all 3 of those guys have played a decent amount for Oklahoma over the last couple of years. So that gives Oklahoma a little bit of some depth and interesting, exactly what Oklahoma was looking for out of him, a guy that could come in the spring and compete immediately for that job. So we'll see how that goes through the rest of the season. There was one position change, Marcus Stripling, who had moved from the defensive end position over to the linebacker, a rush linebacker position. It's one of those things. It's going to be interesting to see how he, adjusts to that position. Stripling is a guy who, in his Sooner career and even at the high school level, has always been a guy who's played with his hand in the ground at a defensive end spot. So moving him over the linebacker, he's probably got a better body to play that linebacker position. But it'll be interesting how he adjusts through the spring. It seems to be doing well, but it's pretty crowded from a rush in perspective. And I think one of the other things that we kind of missed to talk about from a linebacker perspective is Caleb Kelly was a guy that was talked about a little bit Obviously over the spring, kind of coming back to the Sooner program. And he did an interview, and he was very, very honest. I think it was one of the better interviews from a player. Of course, you would expect somebody like that had been in the program for 6 years. This being his 6th year, to be very well spoken and be passionate about the program. But it was kind of interesting, hearing his commentary. He was a guy that really never even thought twice about coming back, which is obviously kind of speaks to his character and his his willingness to be a great football player. It remains to be seen how much he can kind of get in the fold this year. Having 2 knee injuries. He talked a little bit about he's been around this being his 6th season. He's seen a lot. He knows the terminology. He knows the plays. He's kind of a coach on the field in terms of his ability to see the plays. But he said early on in the spring, he was in a position where he could see it, but his body couldn't react at the same speed that his mind was reacting. Then he was talking about here over the last week that his body was starting to catch up with his mind a little bit. So, he might not make a big impact, definitely in the spring, but as his body gets better, as he continues to get stronger and faster, it'll be kind of interesting to see how he's able to get into that linebacker room. Certainly, he's not going to be a starter, but he could be a guy that comes off the bench and spots. And based on our depth discussion that we've been talking about, a guy that can provide solid depth should any of those guys go down.
Get your free Oklahoma mask at voiceofcollegefootball.com. Register for free. You'll find that available at the top of the screen. Register for free, voiceofcollegefootball.com. Get your free Oklahoma mask or whatever team you choose out of 35. And your first purchase, you get 20% off as well. Jason Ray, Last Word on College Football. So we invite you to head on over to Last Word on College Football. Check out a ton of great coverage of college football from Jason, Kevin McGuffey, Tony Siracusa, and others that have been a great support here at the Voice of College Football. And Jason joins us to cover Oklahoma football each and every week. And we've received, Jason, a ton of great feedback on you being here to cover Oklahoma football for us on a regular basis. So we appreciate that.
Absolutely. Enjoy being here.